Well, hello and welcome back to the Conflict Skills Podcast. I'm your host, professional mediator Simon Goode. In this podcast, I provide free resources and tools for dealing with conflict, whether that is connected to workplace conflict or conflict situations outside of work. So if that sounds like the kind of thing that's useful for you, please consider hitting follow or subscribe. In today's episode of the podcast, I'm going to be talking about how to run a mediation session between a manager and a staff member. So I've put a reasonable amount of preparation into this topic, and yet I'm still a little bit apprehensive about finally pressing record because it's the kind of thing, I guess, where there's just an unlimited level of detail that you could go into. I've been a mediator now for over 10 years, and so, of course, I've just got so many different options, and, you can try this, or this tends to be a useful phrase, or, this option kind of works well, etc. So I hope that, and what I've tried to do is to, I guess, find a balance between so high level, this broad brush approach of make sure that you acknowledge what people are saying and balance the time between the parties. I mean, some of these things are so bloody obvious that I find them not very helpful when you're beginning. And I think a lot of managers and leaders, they find themselves in a really tough spot when they need to run a mediation because it's not obvious how to do it. And it, to be honest, is easy to put a step wrong, and probably some of your concerns about what if I make it worse aren't entirely unjustified. I've done a lot of mediations myself where I've been called in as an external mediator after a botched internal mediation attempt, if you know what I mean. So my goal of this episode is to give you some guidance and some tools that you can use to run a mediation session. And I'm going to be talking about a situation where there's a manager and one of their team, a team leader and one of their staff, or it might be an internal staff member who's liaising with external contractors. And there's a difference in power. And that's one of the common, I think, frequently asked questions around workplace mediation is, well, how on earth can this work? They're my boss. Like, how am I meant to go into a mediation session with my boss? And so I'll talk about some of the ways that I manage that, I guess, as an external mediator. But of course, they would be very similar to how you would run things yourself. So I've kind of written this as if you were a senior manager, a department head, something like that, or maybe a small business owner and the conflict is between two of your staff. So the first question I suppose you should think about is, should you even mediate at all? Now, I remember when I first was trained as a mediator, I was doing divorce mediation, so working with families who were going through separation, etc. And back then, I had a clinical supervisor who explained it in this really lovely way, that we assess for the appropriateness of mediation based on three things: capacity, willingness, and safety. So capacity, are the parties able to say what needs to be said? So you've got a staff member and a manager. So one of the things that you might consider is, given that this is their boss, what needs to be in place for that person to be able to say what they need to say? Now, I don't personally like using a metric of they feel comfortable. I want them to feel comfortable saying what they need to say. And of course, they won't feel comfortable doing that when it's their manager. Well, most mediation sessions are pretty bloody uncomfortable. Even I feel very uncomfortable before, during, and after a workplace mediation. So if your decision-making threshold is around whether or not people are comfortable, you're probably not going to mediate. So I consider more along the lines of, can they say what they need to say? Can they hear each other? Are they capable of discussing this topic? Now, that might be to do with decision-making capacity, I suppose. Like, you don't want to send them into a mediation where they're revising their role descriptions, and that's not something that's ever going to fly because, that's a decision that's made at a higher level or something. So you'd also think about, though, a level of, what would you say, emotional volatility that the parties are displaying, etc. And there might be things that you can do to improve one or both of the people's capacity, like offering a support person might be one option, giving them the choice of bringing somebody along. I don't personally particularly like doing that. I find that it inherently creates a different dynamic. Like when you've got a third person, I mean, there's a third person that's me already as the mediator, so this is the fourth person, but, assuming that I'm seen as impartial, The support person isn't. And so every time somebody says or does anything, the support person has a reaction. So I often meet with the support people and I explain to them in quite strong terms the fact that they are not there as a participant for this mediation. It is not part of their role to advocate on behalf of the person that they're supporting. It is not their role to jump in and correct information when they hear something said that's not right. If they have concerns about something that's done, they can talk to me about that during a break, but it is not appropriate for them to jump in. And I explain that if they do, what I'll actually end up needing to do is stopping the mediation and I'll ask them to leave. So I simply say, this is the way it is, Well, of course, we want this person to have the support that they need, and that's why you're there. So you'll hear what's said in the room, you'll have a sense of what might be going on for them, so that then if they need to take a break or go and talk to you about it, and certainly afterwards, you can be there to debrief and support them through it. Of course, you have a much higher level of ability to do that because you've been so connected to the session. But what we don't want is for you to have an influence on the mediation itself. Your influence is to be on the person's well-being, so to speak. It sort of depends. If you're working with factory workers, all of this language might be a little bit touchy-feely. If you're dealing with, a bougie kind of office in the middle of Sydney or whatever, then, really talking about feelings and the fact that everybody should feel comfortable might be something that's really important. I mean, your team, so you'll figure out the right tone, I guess, to pitch this at. But that's the first topic. Can they do what they need to do in the mediation with the supports that I'm able to give them? The second thing is willingness. Now, you might have heard a phrase called a genuine effort or a genuine attempt to resolve the conflict, so to speak. Now, to me, what that actually involves is that both parties are willing to say, put forward their view and express their perspective, and to be willing to listen to the other person's perspective. That's the bottom line for me. If I can get two people in the room who are willing to do that at least, then I, as the mediator, can usually extrapolate some common ground, It sounds like you're both aware that communication's not working at the moment and that team meetings might be a real contributor to that. At the moment, it sounds like you're not sure about what might help, but it sounds like at least that is a perspective that you share in a similar way, albeit you've got a different take on what's causing it. Let's think through some options then about what might help to mitigate this impact on the short term. So immediately we've sort of contained the conflict, so to speak, to this issue. You've both had a chance to have your say, and now I'll do my work to develop options. So that's an important thing to realize, is that the fact that people feel really hopeless doesn't necessarily preclude them from going into a mediation. It's kind of normal to feel hopeless, especially if the problem has been sitting there for a number of years and possibly even getting worse. So we think about capacity. The second thing that we'd think about is willingness. And then finally, I mentioned safety. Now, with divorce and separation mediation, safety is different. You've got things like family violence or suicide or child protection issues, or all these kind of things to weigh up. And so I'm thinking as a family mediator about the well-being of all of these different people involved, even myself and other external stakeholders or other agencies, etc. Whereas this is different. I do think as an employer, especially if it's your business, you probably have both some type of legal duty of care. There's some type of responsibility for the well-being of your staff. In most, modernized countries, that seems to be something that's written into the legislation around industrial relations, etc. But even if you know them and you want the best for them, you might also think about this. Now, for me, when I'm dealing with kids, it's different. But when I'm dealing with adults, I tend to approach this topic of well-being or safety or duty of care or whatever you'd call it in a reasonably transparent way. I talk to them about it. And I say, look, mediation's voluntary. It's ultimately up to the two of you whether or not you participate. Do you have any concerns about the mediation itself? What might go on, or the impact on yourself, or some other negative consequence if the mediation doesn't go well? And they'll often say, yeah, I don't want to do mediation because I don't want to create waves. Things are kind of crap and it's not good, but gosh, the worst thing would be to, open up a can of worms and get other people involved or whatever it is. So we weigh up the pros and cons, and to be honest, I'm not even necessarily an advocate for the mediation. I'm saying to them, look, you'll have to decide. It's not up to me to be the cheerleader and rah, 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 The two of you can work it out. It sort of remains to be seen, I suppose, what the two of you are capable of. I have confidence in each of you, but I think there's a lot of other factors going on here, even things outside of work that's probably influencing both of, how you're thinking. Even if you're not getting much sleep, it impacts you. So I don't think it's as simple as drawing a line of this is the problem kind of thing. And you are capable or you're not capable of doing the mediation. So I don't like that even as a business owner sitting there saying, I don't think you're capable of it. I would probably talk to them about it directly and say, what do you think? And if they express concerns, there are some things that's just, yep, that makes sense. You'll have to weigh that up on balance. What do you reckon? Or, what's your decision? Or other things, there might be factors that you can put in place to mitigate them. Like if they're concerned about other people being involved, I suppose you could say, well, look, would it be helpful if at the beginning of the mediation, we maybe put forward a proposal that what's said in the room stays in the room essentially? And in essence, you would be agreeing to keep the discussion confidential. Would that give you any reassurance about, the fact that other people might be less involved than otherwise? So I'm saying to them, if this was in place, would that lower your concern, et cetera, et cetera? You'll also need to think about whether or not the mediation is internal or external. If I'm honest, and it was my business, I would always do it internal first. I know the people that are involved. I know the style that's going to be helpful, etc. There are obvious drawbacks. I don't have a different, an impartial, removed, neutral relationship. I have a history with them, etc. But I think as the business owner, you can often just name that and say, look, I'm doing my best to remain impartial here. If either of you have concerns that I'm taking sides or giving either of you more of a time to talk or something like that, please let me know, because that's not my intention. Although I have a different relationship with you outside of the room, here my job is to just be a facilitator. If that's your goal, maybe you actually are a stakeholder and you want to have a say in the mediation session. I don't think any of these things are necessarily right and wrong, but you probably want to think strategically about how to do it rather than just jumping into some type of a knee-jerk reaction. So those are the first things I'd think about. Is the mediation appropriate? And then think about that factor of internal or external or not, as I check to make sure that the podcast is still recording. You won't believe the number of times I attempt to record these episodes and then I get distracted or there's some technical problem and I think honestly I probably might have ADHD. I suspect I might, because I just find it so challenging to concentrate at the moment. I mean, that's a very common thing that a lot of people tend to say, but anyway, I sincerely apologize for all of the inherent delays along the way for the podcast. I haven't seemed to be able to keep up a consistent publishing schedule so far, but I'm reasonably optimistic that I'll be able to figure it out by the end of the year at least. In terms of the overall structure for the mediation itself, I normally set up 3 meetings. So one one-on-one meeting with both of the parties, and then followed by a joint mediation session. So when I say I'm going to run a mediation, or would you be prepared to participate in the mediation, that's what I'm talking about, like meeting with me separately first, and then having the joint mediation session. Now, ultimately, it's up to you how you structure all of this, all of the associated other elements too, like confidentiality, for example. So I usually find it helpful to say that during that one-on-one appointment that I will keep the information that they tell me confidential. In other words, I'm not going to raise it during the mediation session, and I'm not going to tell the other party or anybody else without their consent. And that can be challenging when it's an internal mediation. That promise or that assurance is certainly a lot easier to make and to keep when you're an external mediator. So if that's not the case, I would suggest just making it transparent. Let people know what to expect in terms of confidentiality. I normally say, look, could we all do our best to keep the conversation contained to those sessions? And if you feel like you'd need to discuss something else, organise a separate appointment, etc. But that might not be realistic in your situation. The joint mediation session as well, you would need to consider how that happens, what level of formality is used. Like, do you have an agenda, and is it like on-site or is it off-site on a separate meeting room kind of thing? Would it be better to have somewhere that's confidential and private versus somewhere that's public? Do you want Like say you've got two of you that are directors and share owners in the business. Do you want both of you to be there or just one of you? Are there other people involved maybe that might be helpful to be included? Like, is there a senior manager level and maybe they can come in and provide some input at the early stage and then drop off? Or you might like to meet with them to gain their input before the mediation, and maybe you could read out something from them along the lines of the hope that you have for the relationship improving, and it's, some of whatever you've seen, the efforts that they've made or something like that, and some of the negative consequences of the problem at the moment. So think about all of this stuff strategically. I honestly don't think any of this is right and wrong or it's black and white. It really does depend on the people and the situation and your business and your team and your relationship with them. But I would consider all of those different options that I've mentioned. In terms of the logistics, the mediation room itself and probably the pre-mediation rooms, those one-on-one meetings, I would set them up ideally in a private space with water, a notepad and tissues, just everything that you might need ahead of time. And for the joint mediation session itself, when you're going to run a meeting, I would think about some way to externalize the note-taking, like having a whiteboard or a laptop and you're projecting it onto a screen or a data projector or something like that. I find that helpful when I'm doing the agenda. Like it's good to, everybody can kind of look up and see the writing on the wall, literally. These are the topics that we're agreeing to discuss. Have I got that right? It's helpful both because it's clear, like they can see it, rather than you just using a notepad and reading it back to them. Of course, it's more difficult for them to pick up on typos if they're just listening to you. But it's also like, I think it lowers the stress when everybody's focused on some external thing, like the screen when I'm typing up an agenda kind of thing. So I almost use it strategically sometimes. And if you've got a really volatile, heated relationship that you're managing and there's a lot of emotion, maybe a lot of structure would be helpful, like writing out an agenda and printing them both out a copy, for example. First, I'm going to explain the mediation, then you'll have a chance to have your say, then we'll come up with an agenda, then we'll have some discussion, then we'll finalize any agreements needed and discuss next steps. So the pre-mediation, that one-on-one session with the people that are involved, we call them the parties to the mediation or the parties. You really have to balance wisdom and compassion. If you're a senior manager, if you're a business owner, probably you care about the people that are there. And so it's easy to slip into a little bit of a sympathetic way of responding to people, like you poor thing. Maybe not that extreme, although, you poor thing probably sounds absurd. It probably sounds like someone who's completely not caring if you're the kind of person that's like, oh, darling, what's the matter? I can't believe that's happened to you. Oh, my goodness, come and give me a hug. Like if that's your relationship, it can be really challenging when you're sitting in the one-on-one formal meeting and trying to decide how to respond. So I lean towards empathy rather than sympathy. That sounds really challenging for you. That sounds really stressful. That sounds quite overwhelming. It sounds like despite your efforts, that didn't play out the way that you'd wanted it to. It's really kind of summarizing their experience versus adding on my interpretation of their experience, if you know what I mean. You poor darling, like I'm implying that that's a negative thing that happened and that shouldn't have happened, and that might not necessarily be the messages that I want to be sending if I'm trying to be a little bit more impartial and a little bit more neutral. So I think about it in that way. I'm balancing wisdom and compassion. Like I have the compassionate part of me that cares about them, but I also need to balance what's the wise choice here? What other people are involved? What are the longer term consequences of letting poor behavior slide and lowering our standards or whatever it is? So it's not just compassion. Do you know what I mean? I think some people, they approach this one-on-one pre-mediation session. Even mediators do this. Oh, I want to give them a chance to have their say. And I'm like, sure, but you're not their counselor. Like how much of their say are you going to let them have? Like, why? So I don't necessarily just give them a massive chance to vent, but at the beginning I do usually do my best to listen and remain impartial. If they've got very strong views, you can still summarize that and acknowledge it by saying something like, that sounds like really full on, or, from your perspective and from how you see things, that should never have happened. And despite the fact that you raised it several times, it sounds like, at least from where you sit, they didn't listen to you. From where you sit, from how you see things, from your perspective, etc. I'm acknowledging and listening, but I'm adding a little bit of differentiation to myself. Like, this isn't what I believe. This is what you believe, right? And I do my best to still be supportive. Sometimes you can challenge people in this one-on-one session. Like, you could say something like, are you sure about that? Or when you say that was certainly what they intended to do, what is it that makes you so confident about that? What other intentions might they have had if it was something different? So I'm gently kind of scraping around the edges as I soften up that person's black and white perspective. I don't jump in and say, actually, you've got that wrong kind of thing, especially if they're in a very heightened state. It just usually doesn't go well. So I would say something like, it sounds like you do your best to clarify expectations, but you've still found yourself, at loggerheads with crossed wires, and that's caused a lot of problems in the communication between the two of you. And right now, that sounds like a very difficult place to be, and it sounds like, at least from where you sit, it would certainly be worth trying something and seeing if it helps moving forward. We also need to think about the assessment of the situation, like what is happening, but I tend to tread a little bit carefully here because I don't need necessarily to have a full understanding of the situation and the background. Of course, it's tempting to think that I do. I'm interested, I want to know, and I tell myself sometimes that I'll be a better facilitator if I know all of the background. But I actually think sometimes it's the opposite. When I know fully, this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened, it colours our experience. And even hearing, one or two negative things that someone has done, even bizarre things. Like, I remember doing a workplace mediation once, and there was a workplace like romance that had formed and then broken up. So these people had been dating for a while and then separated. And now, unfortunately, one of them had started dating another person, and I think it might have even been someone who they worked with as well. So, you can just imagine how helpful that is for a team functioning, and the dynamics and trust levels and healthy communication and all this kind of stuff. Like, it was a nightmare. Anyway, they both told me they weren't that gross, but in hindsight, like slightly oversharing things about their sex life, for example, or what the other person had done. And I still wish I didn't know that. Like, I wish I never got told that. And I still wonder in the room, like I was going to run the mediation that afternoon, you just don't know, like, how does that impact then your perception of something that they say, because you're thinking about them in this slightly different way based on something that you've been told. So for me, I approach it more that I just want the high level overview, like what happened and then that and then that and then that. Give me the facts, give me the narrative, so to speak. But what I'm really interested in is the things like, what were you thinking at the time? What have you been thinking about since? How did this impact you? Like, what's it cost you? How are you different now, given this problem that you're dealing with? And what difference would it make for you if this problem were to be resolved? And what does that look like? Like, how would you like things to be? If we could fast forward just 2 weeks, it's a small amount of time, but, you were seeing some early positive signs. Like, what would they be? So I do get a bit of a background to the problem, but I'm shifting much more towards those kind of questions. And so that brings me to the next thing that I often focus on in that pre-mediation session, which is the questions that we ask. You've probably heard me talk about the goal framework for coaching, the GROW framework for coaching, I should say, previously. The goal, reality, options, and way forward. And they can all be good questions to ask, like, what is a realistic working relationship like between the two of you? You don't need to be friends, you don't need to be buddies, but, what does need to happen for the communication at least to be manageable from your end? You can ask other oriented questions like, if I were to ask them what you've been like as a team member, what do you think they might say? If I were to ask other members of the team how they would describe the two of your relationship, what do you think they might tell me? And the reason that those questions are so helpful, again, is that it shakes up that black and white perspective that the person has, and maybe even introduces other things for them to think about. Like, well, maybe my being really stubborn and difficult for my boss is actually hurting the people that I work with and that I care about, because it makes a lot of tension and makes it really uncomfortable in the office every morning or something like that. I like scaling questions like, how would you rank it out of 10? What's the level of trust between the two of you? What's the level of product, whatever you want to say, whatever the language is that they're wanting to use, respect or whatever. And then what would it look like if it was, now it's a 3 out of 10? What would it look like if it was a 4 out of 5? What would you be willing to do differently if you were seeing some small positive signs from them instead of this constant wall and barrage of criticism that you've described? So I'm really just, what can you do? What are you willing to do? If they were willing to do that, then what would you be willing to do? Or if, what are you willing to offer in order for me to do that? I need you to do this type of thing. And then finally, we want to clarify the expectations for the joint mediation session. Tell them how it will run, tell them where it will be held, set the time limits, etc. Let them know what they need to do to prepare, who's going to be there, all that kind of stuff. So that's the one-on-one pre-mediation session. The next would be the joint mediation session. So we would assume that we've met with both of the parties, both of the staff that are involved. Maybe with the manager and the staff member, you might also like to ask each of them some slightly different questions in that pre-mediation appointment. Like with the manager, for example, you might say something like, well, some of these decisions are yours to make as the person that's in charge. On the other hand, I know that you want to take a collaborative approach to leadership. So where's the balance for you of inviting input? And then is it you get to have the final say? Like, is that kind of how it works? So we're sort of saying to them, like, where's the balance between giving people autonomy versus top-down decision-making style? Or what do you need to see from them in order for you to give them more freedom and not be as micromanagey or whatever it might be? So I'm really discussing that from the manager's perspective in terms of what can they do. And then on the staff's end, I'm often saying to them, like, given that this person is your manager, you've probably got some concerns about any negative consequences from the mediation. Is there anything that you're particularly worried about might happen, that they might do, or something else? And we talk through those concerns, particularly with the person who's the least powerful, which in this case would be the staff member. I'm really wanting to make sure that I'm paying attention to the things that they're worried about. And it's not just because they're valid concerns and we need to fix them. I mean, some of them are, but just giving them the sense that you're responsive and open to their experience would make it a much more supportive process. So in terms of the joint mediation session, you'll need to decide whether or not you're in the same room or separate rooms, how many facilitators or other people are involved, what's the setup of the room. I often find it helpful to have a round table if possible. It's obviously less adversarial than sitting across a table from each other like a debate or something. Having a whiteboard there can be really helpful. Having a notepad and pen for each of the people to write. And sometimes I say you can use this while the other person's speaking to sort of prevent people interrupting. You want to have water available, which I need to have a sip of my drink at the moment as well. And tissues, particularly if it's likely that people are going to cry, but I think tissues are usually good anyway. I would probably try to have it set up too so that there's like a private space that people can go to if they need to have a breakout. Like if they need to have a break, like just go somewhere by themselves for a little bit. So if you've got the option of booking 3 meeting rooms in your office, for example, that's what I would do. One for the meeting itself, like the mediation itself, and then the other 2 to kind of send the people to if needed. And if that's not viable, having 2 rooms is the next best because you can keep one party with you and send the other one to the breakout room. And if that's not viable, then a space outside or somewhere in the lobby or a cafe that's downstairs or something like that could be an option. In terms of the structure for the joint mediation session, I usually use a reasonably structured approach to the beginning of the session and then open things up as I go. So right early on, I start with often what's called a mediator statement, and that's what I would recommend for you to do too. So this is where you explain why you're meeting, how the session will be run, any particular guidelines or ground rules or clarifying any expectations around confidentiality, etc. You'll talk through how you're going to manage the meeting, like is there an agenda, is it going to be written up on the whiteboard? What are you going to do for your agreements? Are you going to type that up and send them out a draft, or is this just a discussion and you're hoping to sort of just have a goodwill agreement? Like how will everything run? And what we're wanting to do is to give people as much of a sense of what to expect as possible, both because it helps them to know, but it will also lower that level of apprehension and the level of escalation at the beginning of the process. So I do my statement, and it usually includes why we're meeting, which would be something like, look, thank you very much for agreeing to meet with me. As you're aware, we're both meeting to discuss the working relationship between the two of you. I've met with you both individually and you've both shared some of your perspective, and this is a chance now to discuss it between the two of you with one another, both around your take on how things are at the moment, but I'm particularly interested today to find options that might work moving forward. And I know that you're not necessarily going to be friends and this might not necessarily be a quick fix, but my goal today is that this is a helpful step and maybe a shift in direction from some of the negative experiences that you've both had until now. So it's like, this is why we're meeting. Then I'll say something like, my role is blah, blah, blah. So I might say, look, my role is to be a neutral facilitator, although I'm a operations manager or whatever, and I do have an existing relationship with both of you. At least for this meeting, my goal is to facilitate. So I'll do my best to make sure that you both have a relatively equal chance to have a say. If you need to take a break, that's perfectly fine with me. As you go through and put the topics that you'd like to discuss, I'll help you come up with an agenda. And then as we go through and you reach any agreements, I'll take care of the notes for that as well. After the session, I'll send you out a draft. You can make sure that it matches what you've agreed. And then if so, and you're willing to sign it, we'll have a quick meeting this afternoon to finalize things. How does that sound to you? So it's reasonably straightforward. It doesn't take a whole lot of time, but I'm letting them know this is what's going to happen next, kind of thing. In terms of ground rules or rules, I still don't know, why do mediators all say ground rules? Like, what's the difference between a ground rule and a rule? Anyway, if you want to have some ground rules or housekeeping or something like that, you'd need to decide how to do it. Some mediators, I know some managers, they do things like they ask the parties to come up with the rules and what do you think we need as a ground rule for this discussion to be helpful? It just takes so long, and I find honestly it to be a little bit patronizing. So for me personally, I would normally just say, look, thanks very much for meeting with me. This is why we're meeting, blah, blah, blah. This is my role. In terms of ground rules, can we just do our best to make sure that there's only one person talking at a time, which means doing your best not to interrupt. If the other person's saying something that you disagree with, I've given you both a notepad and pen that you can use to write that down. And then after they've finished speaking, you will have a chance to have your say. If it becomes too difficult and we're talking over the top of each other, I might need to move you into separate rooms and then I'll go between the two of you. Of course, this isn't necessarily a workable arrangement moving forward, so my hope is that you'll be able to manage the communication despite the fact that this is quite an emotional topic to go through. So don't interrupt, and then I would normally say something like, use respectful language, don't use abusive language or something like that. Of course, all of these things are subjective and you're going to need to decide ultimately where the line is and when you jump in to enforce it or not. But that's it. Don't interrupt and don't call each other's names, if you know what I mean. You can add other rules if you want, like confidentiality or your role or the structure of the meeting or something like that if you want. So, it's up to you. What else do we talk about in that mediator opening statement? So I mentioned that briefly, like how agreements will be recorded. I would suggest that you draft it up in an email, send it to them as a draft, like in the subject line draft, and your question to them is, does this match the discussion from the meeting today? So I'm not saying, do you want to add anything, any new thoughts? What do you reckon? Should we update it? Are you still willing to agree to it? I'm saying, look, that's what you agreed to. Have I recorded it correctly? I'll do it as quickly as possible, like ideally as soon as I finish the mediation, like type it up that afternoon or that evening, and then send it to them for review that evening if possible. Now, you might want to get them to sign it. I don't know, it depends on where you are in terms of the legislation of whether or not that has much legal impact. Here where we are in Australia, I'm not sure if an agreement from a mediation that's signed or not signed would be weighed any differently by a court, and I'm not even exactly sure in what situation a court might be reviewing this. But I think anyway, there is still some benefit in getting people to sign. I think it shows a commitment to the agreement. There's something about seeing the other person sign as well and kind of put their name to the paper of what they've promised that they're going to do for you, which might encourage both of them really to be a little bit more confident, that they're going to get something back, so they're willing to follow the line instead of reneging or something like that. And then finally, you might want to give them an option to take a break. So that would be the final thing I would be discussing with them. Like, it's up to you whether you need to take a break, just give me a signal, or if you need to duck out, that's fine as well. You also might give them the option to talk to you separately. Like, it's a tricky one when you're the manager, but I probably would say that to them. Look, if something comes up that you're not able to share in front of the other party, you can ask to talk to me about that confidentially. And then if that happens, I would usually give the other person the same chance to do that too. I'm not going to share what they've told me, but I'm going to say, how about you? Like, how are you traveling? Is there anything that you would like to talk to me about as well? Just in order to keep it balanced. So that's the start of that joint mediation session, is what I call the mediator statement. So you don't need to use that kind of formal language. You might just say to them, look, at the beginning of the meeting, I'll explain how things will work and what structure we'll be using, etc. And then you do it. The next thing are what I call party statements. So this is where I kind of throw the ball to the two people that are involved in the mediation and give them a chance to have their say. Now, how you do this really does affect how it goes. When I was first trained as a mediator, I can remember the mediators that I was like following and learning from would use very open-ended questions. So they would start by saying, well, look, I'd like to hear from both of you. So what's your perspective on the conflict? Or what's your perspective on the relationship between the two of you? And then immediately the parties would start this massive whinging and complaining, just dump on the other person. And then they'd say, right, yeah, that sounds like a lot. Okay, and other person, what's your take on the conflict? And it's like, what do you think they're going to say? They've just listened to 5 minutes of the other person ranting about what an evil devil they are. I mean, of course they jumped in and then, reciprocated, and it was off to a bad start from the word go. So if there's a pretty hostile relationship, if you know what I mean, between the manager and the staff member, I would probably keep the agenda question very focused. So I'd keep that party statement focused to the agenda. So I would ask a question like, well, look, Darren, what are the topics that you feel it's important to discuss today? As opposed to, Darren, what's your take on the conflict and what's been contributing to all of these problems? And he's like, well, it's all her fault kind of thing. So what are the topics you'd like to discuss? What are the areas that you'd like to include? Even just what are the things you'd like to put on the agenda? I usually find that more helpful. Now, if it's volatile, they'll probably still find a way to slip in a bit of a complaining about the other person. And at that early stage, I just let it go. So I let the first person just speak, and I do my best to take notes, almost like word for word if I can. And then I might ask the other person to do the same thing. And then I would summarize both of what they've said in detail. So I'd say, Darren, what are the topics that you'd like to discuss today? And, Angela, while he's speaking, can I get you just to hold on to your thoughts? And then I'll turn to you in a moment. Darren, please go ahead. And then he'll say, well, I want to talk about time off. Every time I ask for a day off, she gives me the runaround or something. And I feel like my work's not acknowledged and you took credit for this and something else. So he'll say 3 things or something like that. And I'll say, look, thank you very much, Darren. I really appreciate that. And I've taken notes on what you've said. I'll come back and make sure I've heard you correctly in a moment. Angela, you don't necessarily need to respond to what Darren said at the moment, but from your perspective, what agenda items would you like to include on the meeting today? So I'm really deliberately sort of diverting the attention away from that barbed, attack that she's just copped kind of thing. So she'll probably still get back at him and say, well, actually, I have tried to do this and he doesn't understand how busy I've been and we're short-staffed and whatever else it is. And so I'll let them both kind of have their say. Ideally, it's about what are the topics to discuss on the agenda. And I'm taking notes. And then the next step is that I want to summarize what both of them have said to me in detail. Now, personally, I try to do this almost word for word if I can. Like, okay, so Darren, you talked about the team meetings as being one area that has been causing problems. As you put it, they've actually been quite a horrible experience. And it doesn't sound like it's been something that's a recent change. From where you sit, actually, the team meetings have been quite dysfunctional for a couple of years. And you actually outlined a number of examples where decisions had been made at the meetings that weren't followed through with. So meetings was the first thing that you talked about. You also raised the issue of approvals for leave, and then maybe how tasks were distributed amongst the team and whether or not, things were equal or maybe particular people were given more than their fair share. Have I heard that right? So I'm really summarizing that in paragraph form. Like I'm leaning into the negative side of it and acknowledging it in full valence, if you know what I mean. Like you've called them horrible. I'm going to say that they're horrible. You've said that they're a nutcase. You've said that they're an absolute douchebag, whatever. I would say in your words and from how you see things, but this is it. And then I'd say, okay, and Angela, from your perspective, you've got quite a different view. And that makes sense given you've had quite different experiences. From where you sit, though, you also acknowledge the fact that the team meetings have been quite a negative experience, but you've actually tried a number of different strategies to improve things. And at least from your perspective, there have been a number of roadblocks, including some of the behaviours that you described from Darren. From where you sit, it sounds like the ideal arrangement would be not to have these team meetings. So that could be one of the things that we could discuss in the meeting, and there might be other ideas that the two of you can come up with as well. Have I heard that right? So at the beginning, I'm very tentative, like, have I got this right? I just want to make sure that I understand where you're coming from, etc. Summarize what both of them have said. And then the final step in this section is coming up with the agenda. Like you can kind of call this the common ground or the middle ground. Okay, well, look, you've both recognised that communication isn't working and that team meetings are a major contributor to this. So I would just say it seems like team meetings, leave approval, something else are the agenda items. Should we include that? How does that sound to the two of you? I just do them as 1 or 2 words per topic. Like the topic is team meetings. Some managers, some mediators do things like the agenda is a question, like how can we improve team meetings? And then the next agenda item will be something like, how can we make leave approvals less irritating or something like that? It's just so annoying, and I just find it very distracting. If it were me, I'd just keep it simple. And maybe it's because of that, the KISS acronym and the last S that's normally in it. So as you move through the different topics, you kind of just need to balance each person's contribution. Once you've got the agenda items up on the board or on the data projector or whatever, and you say to them, have I got that right? I normally just ask them, well, where should we start? You can, especially if you are in a leadership role or it's your business, you might deliberately choose a topic that you think is less controversial, like maybe they've talked about team meetings and you're a bit worried about how that one's going to go because of this incident that happened 6 months ago. So maybe they've also put leave approvals. So you might say, look, I'd like to begin with that one. Darren, you raised that. Could you let me know your thoughts about this? So you can kind of be reasonably directive, if you know what I mean, of here's where we're going to start. I personally would probably just be quite open and say, where should we begin? What do you think would make sense? I mean, probably there are some little hand grenades or like can of worms that are going to open in some topics, but I actually wonder what progress you've made if you talk about the less controversial topics first, but there's this massive elephant in the room still sitting there. Like I don't think probably there's much genuine agreement and genuine discussion going on around the other topics, but anyway, that's my perspective and there's different views on it, obviously. So as they're going through, and particularly when they come up with options and when they reach agreements, I would be writing them down as much as possible. I tend to use even a structure that implies that this is just draft. Like if I'm typing and I've got a data projector or a laptop on the screen, I would put draft in a big heading up the top. You know what I mean? Like draft in a watermark on the page, draft on the top of the agenda on the whiteboard or something like that. And I'm lowering the stakes. Like I'm wanting to give the sense that we can just explore options in this safe space, especially if you're working with a manager and a staff member. It's like a sandbox where we can just bounce around different ideas. So I do my best to let them know that, look, you don't need to decide anything yet. At the moment, we're just generating options. This might be the thing that you agree to at the end, or maybe you'll come up with something else by then. That's up to you. So on the whiteboard, I'm keeping record of it. I'm summarizing progress. I'm summarizing the agreements, etc. And I'm trying to create a sense of momentum. I don't necessarily like it when managers and leaders take on like this cheerleader role. Like you are just doing so well. You're so great. You've made so much progress. Personally, I would say, well, look, you've actually made quite a bit of progress, and that's around a topic that you weren't feeling very optimistic around. So let's see what other progress you can make. What do you think? Like I want them to almost convince me to continue. Do you know what I mean? Like I don't want to be the one that's pulling the barrow up the hill. It's going to be too tiring and ultimately when they leave, neither of them are going to be motivated for making it work, and it's all going to fall apart anyway. So I'd just be like, look, you're making progress. It sounds like this is something you're prepared to agree to. How does that sit with you, etc.? Now, when we're reaching agreements, that's the language that I often use. Either, is that something that you can agree to, or is that something that you can live with? I think one of the mistakes that managers make is that they say, are you happy with that? And that is just such a dumb phrase. Are you happy with that? It's so patronizing, but no, I'm not bloody happy with this. Would you be happy with this? Like, unfortunately, I've put my own foot in my mouth a few times, but I've certainly seen that one backfire for a lot of people. So you're going through the topics where they're developing options and reaching agreement. You're taking notes. You're giving them really good progress. I mean, it all sounds like sunshine and rainbows, right? In reality, you're probably going to need to employ de-escalation tactics many times during the mediation. So that's the next thing that I would prepare for, is how am I going to calm things down? Now, there's things that you can do, like your voice and body language. A voice that's lower tone, slower speed, lower volume would be helpful. Limiting your gestures and movements, like just being relatively still, controlling and holding yourself in a way that seems confident and assured will give them that same impression from you. You can also control the timing and the structure. Like sometimes I say, let's take a break, or let's first I'm going to hear from you and then I'm going to hear from you. Like I really structure things that you're going to take turns, and I'll let you know when it's time to speak and when it's not, if they're having trouble interrupting each other, etc. I also often suggest, particularly managers who are acting as a mediator, that you can speak for a while to cool things down. If they just keep interrupting things, and particularly if you're in a senior role, sometimes just summarizing where things are up to and, well, you know, there's been a lot of thought and build up to this mediation session. So, and of course, this has been quite a significant experience for both of you, and I very much appreciate the amount of preparation that you've put in. We've gone through a number of topics. Some of them have been easier and others have been quite challenging. And right now I know that there's a lot of emotion around this particular topic that we're discussing of this. What I'm going to suggest in a moment is that we take a break. But before we do that, do either of you want to ask any questions or mention anything else? So I'm really slowing things down by giving this massive soliloquy, I guess. I'm the narrator in the room kind of thing. You can either finish it by saying this is what we're going to do now, or you can just pass it back to them by saying something like, so given all of that, what do you think would be the best use of the last 45 minutes that we have remaining? You should, by structure, provide them with the factors that help for de-escalation too. Like when I'm doing de-escalation skills training, I often talk about things like giving autonomy and a sense of control, providing them with certainty, giving them status, like the sense of importance and that they matter, or relatedness, like empathy. So throughout the mediation session, I'm also employing those things. I give them the choice of when they want to take a break, or when I'm recording an agreement, I'm very much saying, have I got that right? Is that something you can agree to? Is that the best language there? Would it be better to use a different phrasing? What would work for you? Uncertainty, like we've got another 5 minutes until we take a break, or this is, my role, etc. Status would be something like, look, it's really up to you. These are important factors that affect your day to day, and we don't want to rush things. And then relatedness, like summarizing their perspective. I know for you, you're in a real dilemma because you care about this, but at the same time, this is one of the constraints that you're managing, and it makes it really difficult to think through some of these decisions. So then finally, as you're getting towards the end of the mediation session, I usually finish with just a little bit of a summary in a very general way. Like if we started the mediation with a very structured process that was pretty high level, to be honest, like what are the agenda items? At the end of the session, we also finish in a similar way. It's very structured and it's reasonably high level. Sometimes when they're describing a mediation session, they use a diamond. And the idea is that at the beginning, it's a very narrow focus. And then as you move through the different areas or the different sections of the mediation, you expand the discussion and expand the options, and you're very curious and it's very exploratory, etc. And then towards the end of the session, it's like, what's the agreement? What are the things that you're actually going to do? Who's responsible for what, etc. So again, much more, what would you say, like specific and discrete, I guess. So for me, the summary tends to be not that long. It doesn't ideally open up many can of worms. It's more like, well, look, you've agreed to meet and do the mediation and you've both met. You've had a chance to have your say, and I appreciate the fact that you've both done your best to listen to each other. You've reached a number of agreements around team meetings, leave approval processes, and at the same time, there's a couple of issues that still remain unresolved, particularly this topic of, dealing with casual staff or something like that. What I'm going to do now is to draft up these agreements, and I'll send you both a copy of it. Now, what I'd like you to do is to check for any typos and make sure that I've recorded it that matches your understanding of the meeting today. If so, what I'd like to do is to meet briefly before we leave. If you're free around 3:30, that would work for me. And assuming that you're both willing to sign and agree to it, then you can both leave for the day. How does that sound to you? So then you might consider something like a follow-up session after the mediation. Some managers ask me questions like, should I call the parties? And I usually say no. So I would say goodbye and let them go, and probably try not to have any other interaction with both of them that day, because they're going to spill out and they're going to probably try to both enlist you to be on their side and make sure that you agree with how unreasonable the other person was or whatever else it might be. So I'd just keep a little bit of distance and maybe even just tell them that ahead of time. Look, I'm not going to be able to speak today, but what I'd like to do is organise a time to catch up tomorrow morning with both of you separately. So that would be how I'd do it. I'd do the mediation session, don't see them, don't talk to them again for the rest of the day if possible. Then the next day, I would meet them for a touch base kind of conversation. And that's really just how you're traveling, any concerns about the meeting yesterday, something like that, anything else that you think might be needed at this stage. It's very brief. I'm really just wanting to make sure that there's nothing sitting there that I'm not aware of, like they feel like they've been railroaded or bullied or harassed or something like that. So assuming that they're both fine, what I would normally do then is to schedule a review meeting. And I normally recommend that around 2 to 3 weeks afterwards. If you're working with staff who are full-time or at least like 3 days a week or something, it's usually enough time for them to get a new bit of history between them. Like they've had a few interactions by that stage after a couple of weeks. But if things are not going well, it doesn't give enough chance for everything to come undone. So if I meet them in 2 weeks and they say, well, they said that they were going to be respectful, but from the word go, they were, giving me this facial expression or something, whatever it is, it's like, I'd prefer to deal with that now. And it might be that I actually consider escalating the level of assertiveness that I use. Like as a mediator, I've given them a chance. We've done a mediation. From my perspective, maybe I have provided them with an opportunity to resolve it, and it hasn't happened. And so this isn't a situation that I can allow to continue moving forward. So I now need to make some difficult decisions. So, sometimes you can flag that ahead of time. I don't think you necessarily need to, but I would have that review meeting in the diary. And I think probably around the 2-week mark is ideal. If you've got staff who don't work together much, don't see each other, maybe a month or something like that would be fine. After a month, I don't think there's probably much point of even meeting. There'll be so much new things that have happened in between now and then that it probably the mediation would feel like a distant memory to them. So how does that sit with you? That way of approaching the workplace mediation process, particularly when you're thinking about that dynamic of a manager and a staff member, and maybe you've had experiences running a mediation between a manager and a staff member. I'd love to know your thoughts, if you'd be willing to share a comment. And if it's been helpful for you, the thing that I would be insanely grateful for is if you would be willing to leave a positive review if possible. Consider pressing follow or subscribe. But do you know anyone who's dealing with conflict between a manager and a staff member? I'd be really grateful if you might consider sending them this podcast as a bit of a resource. And if you would like other, I don't know, what would it be, like a YouTube video around this topic? Or would you like me to answer some frequently asked questions around running internal workplace mediations? Or maybe you'd like me to talk about some of the interesting cases that I've been a mediator for. I'd love to know your thoughts. I want to make the podcast as useful as possible. So yeah, I'd welcome any input that you would be willing to provide. The best way to get in touch is email. It's podcast@simongoode.com, or otherwise just leave a comment or a review in whichever the platform is that you're listening. Thank you very much, as always, and I hope to see you again in a future episode of the Conflict Skills Podcast. Bye for now.